Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this panel, which is about a very important, it's sensitive, complicated issue, but a very important issue to discuss, which is racism in healthcare. My name is Sarah Hamed, and I'm going to be the moderator of this session. So a little bit about myself. I'm a dentist. I've worked as a dentist both in Sweden and in Sudan. I have a master's in international health, and currently I'm doing my PhD in sociology at Uppsala University on the topic of racism in healthcare, focusing on the views of healthcare professionals in Sweden. And it's part of a larger project on racism in healthcare, which we'll hear more about during the session. I'm going to introduce our four distinguished panelists, and after that we're going to hear their presentations about the topic. So on my right is Professor Hanna Bradby. Hanna is a professor of sociology and currently works at the University of Uppsala. She has previously worked at the Universities of Warwick, King's College London, the University of Essex, and the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. Her research examines connection between health, racism, and ethnicity. And currently she's the leader of various projects on migration and health, including a project financed by the Swedish Research Council looking at racism in Swedish healthcare. And then to the right of Hanna is Professor Stephanie Hatch, who's visiting us from the UK. Professor Stephanie is a professor of sociology and epidemiology at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. She has studied in the United States and previously worked at Columbia University, and her research focuses on urban mental health, inequalities in mental health and health services, discrimination. She is also a leader and co-leader in various projects, one of which examines inequalities and discrimination experiences in health services. And to the right of Stephanie is Professor Beth Maina Albari, who's a professor of international health with background in sociology. She's previously worked at Karolinska Institutet and has conducted research in Eastern and Southern Africa and Sweden, focusing on methodological issues in the study of sexual and reproductive health, gender, migration, and health, and also has a special interest on participatory action research. She is the head of research at the Skaraborg Institute for Research and Development, and also works at the Department of Sociology at Uppsala University with Professor Hanna Bradby on the project which deals with racism in Swedish healthcare. To the right of Beth is Ilyas Ibrahim, and he's one of the country's youngest human rights lawyers. He works at the Bureau Against Discrimination, Byrån mot diskriminering, in Östergötland, which is a non-profit organization that works with human rights issues and anti-discrimination. He studied his master's degree in business law at Linköping University, and then he went on to work in the civil society because of his interest in human rights issues. He also chairs a new solidarity organization called Swifrica, which also works with human rights and development issues in Africa. So we're going to hear all of our panelists, different presentations on the topic of racism in healthcare, and then we're going to have a discussion together, and then we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience. So the first presenter is Professor Hanna.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the generous introduction, and thank you for being here to listen to this. I'm going to talk about racism in healthcare. So this is, let's see if we can make the technology work. This is the details of the project that Sarah's already mentioned, that's funded by Vetenskapsrådet. And here is the research team, most of whom is here today, but a special mention to Suruchi Tapabjöket, who was unable to be here today due to teaching commitments. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What do we mean by racism in this context? Well, before I say what it is, let's give the health warnings that it's a highly emotive subject. But it's definitely a specific form of discrimination in the way that we're thinking about it in this research project. So for the purposes of a kind of introduction to try and create some vocabulary for discussion, I'm going to offer 3 different sorts of racism, 3 different ways of thinking about it. So there's old-fashioned biological racism, there's the more recent manifestation of racism that's cultural, and then there's something that at the moment I'm calling subtle insults that I'll explain a bit about, and in some ways this is where our research is focusing. So biological racism is the idea that there's inherent hierarchies in humanity. There are various different versions of this that have played out historically, but people with white skin and thin noses always seem to end up on the top, strangely. So this is the kind of models that were developed during the era of scientific racism. These have been widely and repeatedly rejected. We're not going to spend any time really thinking about them as such, although those meaning systems clearly underpin some of what we're coping with nowadays. So both scientifically and politically, those have been explicitly rejected. Versions of cultural racism you might all recognize in terms of there being no explicit description of a hierarchy, so there's a great reluctance to actually say which group is better than another group, but there are nonetheless negative judgments involved around people's lifestyle, their values, their religion, and these can be detected in different sort of visible aspects around clothes that people wear, food that they eat or are purported to eat, are thought to eat, and also family organisation, gender division of roles, how marriages are convened, these sorts of cultural organisation. Now, the subtle form of racism we could describe as gentle ways of deprioritising particular groups, of blanking particular groups, of ignoring, of circumnavigating particular groups, which may just look like ordinary rudeness, but are often playing out in conjunction with organisational rules that deprioritise particular groups as well. So there's 2 ways of thinking about that subtle racism. And often the question comes up, is that really racism? You're being oversensitive. Actually, that's just that you are not prioritised for whatever it is that's under discussion. So racism is difficult to talk about. It's difficult to talk about the experience of racism. And in various interviews that I've been involved with, people have regularly said, well, I haven't experienced racism because, I'm too smart. Other people have. So none of us want to be victims of other people's prejudices. It's hard to hear racist views because it's hard to express them in a way that's acceptable, I'm glad to say. So I am not racist, but is a kind of something to make your heart drop, but not unusual to hear. So even the racists don't want to be racist. Even the political parties that have what look like racist views go out of their way to explain how they're not racist, really. There's anxiety about the words that we can use to talk about racism, and some of that is political correctness. Now, political correctness itself is a phrase that's been stolen. What's wrong with being politically correct? That sounds like a good idea to me, but it's turned into a bad idea. And there's certainly a good measure of what has been labelled white fragility around this area. So a kind of people's feelings being hurt if this topic is even discussed. So our suggestion in the research group is that there's a real need for participative methods around even beginning to talk about racism, around even beginning to find how to have a constructive discussion about this emotive and difficult topic. So this is not necessarily a novel idea, but it is an idea that needs pursuing, we think. And we think it's particularly urgent to think about how racism can be undone in healthcare for various reasons and for various groups. So for people who are getting healthcare users, by definition, if one arrives in healthcare, one is likely to have a symptom, to be in pain, to have problems that are disrupting one's life. And that could be described as being a supplicant. So one has come looking for service, seeking help, and that puts one in quite a vulnerable position, especially if one then receives some of these kind of negative feelings. Now, for staff in healthcare settings, there's often a professional ethos, a requirement to put the patient first, for instance, which if then one is subject to racism, that duty of care to the patient is in conflict with the need to shelter oneself from racist insult. So that's another set of difficulties. For staff who are lower skilled, then there's another set of structural problems in working under orders from management or from clinical staff, which makes it difficult to talk about racism. So the risks of discussing racism play out differently for different groups in healthcare, but they exist for all the different people involved in healthcare. So for patients, then it might be the fear that if you talk about the way that racism has affected your care, then you might not get care anymore, or you might get poorer care. For people who are working in healthcare, then there's the uncertainty about your caring role being compromised. How do you both call out racism and carry on looking after people? And then this is a common anxiety that if you talk about things that make your working life difficult, you become that difficult colleague that nobody wants to work with. Okay, I'm going to give just a few examples of some of the ways that people have talked about racism in our study, really to show how difficult it is to sort out these different strands within a healthcare setting. So here's someone who talked to us. She's a woman in her 50s of Sudanese origin. She's lived in Sweden for a long time and she talks really good Swedish. And she said to us, I felt that the Swedes get the established doctors while the foreigners get interns. It's a feeling I got. But like I said, I don't have proof. So there was no clear moment where this woman felt that she was being deprioritized, but just this sense that at various little moments she was constantly being deprioritized. But she was aware that there was no hard proof of this. A dentist who we spoke to talked to us about the ways in which his patients had talked to him during the migration crisis, the so-called migration crisis. In my experience, there were many patients who thought that we are prioritizing asylum seekers and that we have forgotten our Swedish patients. We heard that a lot. So this dentist really felt that the kind of complaints had shifted during this period of time. I don't know if this has to do with the election, this was the last election, or with SD, with Sverigedemokraterna, but people are more open with what they feel and think. But one wants to treat people, but one does not want to refuse care, but. So this dentist felt really caught in a difficult dilemma of people complaining that they were being deprioritized when that wasn't what this dentist thought was happening at all. So again, there's no straightforward sense of discrimination, but there's a sense of hurt on various people's parts. We've also had people talk to us about having pretty straightforward insults in healthcare settings. So a patient tells a nurse that he does not want his hemorrhoids treated by the svartskalle. Now, the translation of that term is difficult. I think that if you ask Mr. Google, then Google translates it as wog, which is a highly insulting term in English. So he used a very insulting term to say he did not want to be treated by this black doctor, he wanted a white doctor. The white colleague persuaded the patient to have both doctors treat him, so this patient using insulting terms got double the amount of resources, and actually at the end of the story they were all friends, which is a kind of interesting twist on the tale. Similarly, staff have discriminatory problems with each other, so we had general practitioners who felt they were being poorly paid compared to their white colleagues, and we had surgeons who felt that their nursing staff did not trust them because of their ethnic background. These are all quite familiar stories, I think. Okay, these examples we could replicate and go on, but I think one of the things they show is that there is a really urgent need to speak about racism, partly just because it's complicated. It's not an easily solved problem. And we think this is important both for staff to make workplaces easier to work in, better to work in, but also for equality of access to care. So this is a social justice issue. And not just access to care, but also quality of care. These are two slightly different ideas. So we're at the beginning of a project where we're very interested in getting your thoughts, suggestions, and stories, so please do talk to us after this session. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. And now it's Stephanie's presentation.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation to come along and speak to you today. I feel very honored to be on this panel talking about a very important issue. And I'm going to focus today on some recent work that I've been developing, focused on tackling inequalities and discrimination experiences in health services, and tell you a bit about how I came to study this. I first want to start by thanking my team who worked tirelessly to deal with a very sensitive and difficult subject, also in the UK. I came over to the UK 15 years ago from the US, and having grown up in the southern part of the US in Atlanta, Georgia, race was a part of a discussion that we had on a daily basis. So when I came over to the UK, I remember going and giving my first academic talk, and I used the word race. And I watched all the tuttering and the shifting in the seats and people very uncomfortable. I was interrupted. I was told that in the UK they did not use the word race and that I was to only use the word ethnicity. And being the person that I am, I came back immediately and said I will continue to use the word race because I'm referring to a phenotype. In this situation, I'm referring to skin color. And that is exactly what we're talking about. Because whether we like it or not, there's a reality around race. There's this fundamental reality both in the use of race and ethnicity, and that people are sorted by a socially defined criteria. And this criteria is a process that happens over the life course, so from very young in childhood all the way through life, contributes to your social position and your experiences, your opportunities, also contributes to your health status. And that's a bit why I focus on discrimination in particular. I like to focus on it because it is something that people can get their heads around. This is only one part of the conversation, but it's part of the conversation that focuses on behaviors, and behaviors that happen across multiple life domains and may be motivated by multiple attributes, one of them being race. I point out to people that race is important here because discrimination is a stressor with this life course narrative. So for those of us, like myself, who grew up being a minority in a country, moved to another country and was also a minority, this is something that I've learned to deal with from a very young age. For others, and people that I've talked to quite recently, pointing out the importance of becoming othered. So moving from a country where you were in the majority, and then all of a sudden having to think about the color of your skin, and what that does and how that shapes your experiences. So it's shaped by multiple statuses and identities. It limits the diversity. Discrimination in particular limits our diversity within higher education and occupations. It's got strong effects on our health, and I want to stress that, so that we understand that this is not just about how we get along with each other, but that it's real in its consequences. It's got strong implications for your mental health as well as your physical health. The evidence is clear. And it's got pronounced effects in terms of healthcare practices, as we've already heard. So I started looking at this within a study that I had the opportunity to lead, starting back in 2008, our Southeast London Community Health Study, where we went into over 1,000 households and interviewed people 16 years and older. And there we were just asking general questions about social circumstances, how people were living in their neighborhoods, about their health, about their relationships, to get a general picture of what was having an impact in terms of people's mental health as well as their physical health, because I often look at the interface of the two. So Southeast London, the area that I was studying, is very ethnically diverse and also socioeconomically diverse. And I was able to start asking questions around discrimination. Prior to this, we had very limited information and data on discrimination within the UK. I was lucky enough to collaborate with Professor David Williams from Harvard, who had developed a measure that allowed us to look at how people were experiencing discrimination across a wide range of life domains, but also thinking about how we then start to focus on other aspects of it, witnessing, anticipating discrimination. So by anticipating discrimination, I mean, avoiding certain situations because you're going to be treated unfairly. And what we found is that it was most prevalent among the Black Caribbean group, but surprisingly, a group that we defined epidemiologically as white other, predominantly from Eastern European countries, had similar or greater reporting to our Black Caribbean and Black African groups. Now, again, discrimination has a pervasive effect, and I cannot stress this enough. No matter what we throw at it, we're unable to reduce its effect on health. And it has an impact, particularly in domains such as education, employment, and health services. So I started to think about discrimination in the workplace and what we knew. And it's very little, actually, particularly with regards to what was going on in the UK. So I started to get very discouraged, but then I started to look more broadly at what policies were being developed. And one of the things that I can say is that there was a moment in 2014 where a group of people came together and decided that the National Health Service needed to address what was going on, to no longer make it something that they weren't going to talk about. So they developed the Workforce Race Equality Standard. And people got behind it. It got heavy weight behind it, and it was mandated across England in 2015. So this is the policy working, and it's the policy working to identify within individual trusts what's going on. So they have 9 indicators that they require every single National Health Service trust in the country to report on, so that we can ensure that there's equality by race across these indicators having to do with people's salaries, how they're hired, recruited, the disproportionate number of Black and ethnic minority staff that are being disciplined, asking people questions in their NHS survey around discrimination, but also harassment, bullying, and abuse, the type of abuse that we've heard about. And then also representation in the most senior level. Who's making the decisions? Is there inclusion on those boards? Now, so for many of you may know, out of all of England, London is the most ethnically diverse, and it has the largest proportion of migrants. It came out the worst in terms of the RES indicators. And I've given you some figures here to highlight this. So taking all these things together, I started to think about what were the implications and starting to approach the RES team about working with them to think about how do we address these disparities that were growing, particularly for those in racial and ethnic minority groups, being particularly vulnerable and suffering the disproportionate levels of abuse. If left unchecked, and I say likely here, but now we're starting to build the evidence in this area, it is strongly associated with poor staff retention, poor staff health, diminished quality of life, stunted career progressions, and also having a tremendous impact in terms of patient safety, patient care. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to go on in terms of the evidence, so the onus is on us to build up that evidence. And what I wanted to do is just not to look at people's experiences, but think more broadly around it. Think about the racism and the discrimination that people are witnessing. thinking about this idea of this anticipated discrimination, this high level of vigilance that people have and live with on a day-to-day basis going into work, but also in their communities. So I started to think about discrimination as this tractable problem, a place that we could focus our energy on together between building the evidence within research, but also working with policymakers and working with the NHS to try and deal with this. I was lucky to go to the Wellcome Trust and make a case that they could get behind. And I wanted to be very clear that this was something that I wanted to focus on, both from the perspective of patients and service users, but also healthcare practitioners who had been left out of this dialogue. And thinking about how this is related to my broader work around health inequalities and how it may generate and perpetuate these inequalities. So I've come up with this seemingly simple model, but just not only thinking about the ways in which these things work, but how dynamic this process is. To give you a sense of some preliminary results, this is just an idea about what our demographics. We started off really wanting to get to have a survey for, aiming to get about 600 healthcare practitioners to fill out the survey across London NHS trusts. I had that within the 6 months, and luckily the funder was able to extend additional funding for me to keep going. So to date, we've got 931 healthcare practitioners across different occupational groups participating in this survey. And just to give you an idea about the preliminary results, it's looking pretty grim. So in terms of the reporting of discrimination and who is reporting the discrimination, we're seeing similar patterns to what we'd already been shown in the NHS survey, but I think being independent from the employer has made a difference. More people have come forward in terms of the experiences they're having. One of the patterns that's most alarming is that it used to be that it was mostly from patients and patients' families, and now the majority of these experiences are from their colleagues and managers. So it's a greater proportion of reporting this type of discrimination among migrant staff from all racial minority groups, very much and strongly associated with poor mental health and physical health, long periods of sickness absence, and low job satisfaction. One of the great things about this measure, it allows us to ask people, well, what do you attribute that discrimination to? And this just gives you a summary by these categories of the primary reasons that they listed and the secondary reasons that they listed. And I think it speaks for itself. So utilizing a way of measurement that allows you not to make assumptions, not to use the standard line of, have you ever been discriminated against because of your ethnicity, race, religion, allowing people to actually say that has been very helpful. And so I'll just sort of wrap this up by saying that one of the things that was slightly unexpected, and I don't suppose should have been, was the overlap between these experiences of discrimination and bullying and harassment. And it's certainly an area that I think we need to pay attention to. So in terms of next steps, myself as a mixed methods researcher, I think it's incredibly important to get the context, to sort of take what's in the number. So take these statistics and provide more in-depth information. So we're in the process of doing in-depth interviews with healthcare practitioners to understand what their experiences are. We're also in the process of starting a virtual reality study to look at how bias influences healthcare practitioners' behaviors and clinical decision-making. So something that we're not only developing using virtual reality for this purpose, but also working with an organization to think about other ways that we can help this conversation continue, a very difficult one, and sometimes it needs a little bit of help with these types of methods. And then finally, thinking about what sort of intervention, how can we utilize this information to make a change. So thank you so much. I want to make one last mention of the work that we do around engagement, both with the public and the community and with service users and health practitioners through our Heron network. So my I feel very, very strongly about in research there's a level of reciprocity, a high level of reciprocity. It is at the basis of what we should all be thinking about. So what can we give back? And that's what the HERA Network is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's quite interesting that your quantitative data reflects our qualitative data in terms of the complexity of racism. So there's racism from patients towards healthcare providers, among healthcare providers, and from healthcare providers against patients. So, Beth, it's your turn now.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Hello. Wait. It didn't. No, it didn't go big. It's there. Oh. Excuse me. Thank you very much for coming. And I want to focus on another aspect of racism. And I want to talk about how working together, the bottom-up kind of approach using participatory methodologies where you engage everybody. And I want to start from some words of wisdom from an African proverb and ask or say, if you do not know where you come from, you can be sure you cannot know where you are going. And this is a proverb that I felt very good to use because both Hannah and Stephanie are talking about the complexity, the silence, and how we are unable to deal with the issue of racism because of the silence. And my question was, or before I say this, there is the paradox of the minorities. Okay. Which one should I use? We have the, the paradox where the minority groups carry the heaviest burden of ill health, poor health, premature death, and definitely the chronic illness. And then, of course, there's also limited data to talk about this. So anyway, before I discuss the participatory methodologies which could help us to create the language and the vocabularies, let me go through a little bit about where we have come from. Because I believe we tend to forget. And then we are wondering when we are there, hey, what is this? What is this monster? I would like to say that racism is a historical phenomenon that was very useful for the capitalist development and modernization of Western countries. During this history, of course, it was very violent through slave trade and enslavement of African people, colonialism, violence, and forced displacement of indigenous peoples. Then there was the Holocaust, genocide within the world wars. So that history, I guess we don't need to remember it all the time, but knowing how we are struggling with this process, we needed to ask ourselves, is colonial system over? We can say no, because we know that there are systems, corporations that are working not for the interest of everybody, but for themselves. We come to that. After this conspicuous violence, conspicuously violent racism, we started getting, okay, after the World War, after the genocide, after the Holocaust, then UNESCO came up and said, well, it's not, we don't have biological differences. And from that, laws have been being made. For example, here in Sweden in 1973, the Swedish government argued with the United Nations that we don't need laws here because people are anti-racist. In 1914, the then integration minister, of course, also said, well, we don't need laws in the books because Sweden should go away or run away from the being seen as xenophobia. Then, of course, other processes in this history, we had the human rights, not human rights, but the civil rights in the USA, where the black people came up and said, well, we are there. We have in the colonies in the South, anti-colonial movements for independence. And then I would like to say, though we are in academia, the academia has been also silent in some ways because there have been the feeling that modernization or the capitalist system was very internal. It didn't have the empire, it didn't have the colonies. So that also has silenced what we are talking about today. Then, eventually came the neoliberal system or capitalism, which said, it has the ideology of the market. And this meant that it is, the market reigns, and we started seeing some kind of decay of the welfare state. We started seeing that, there were a paradox of loss. The states could not control the capital. And remember, we are always talking about the state should do this and this and this. But there are also these structural mechanisms taking place there and removing the power of the state on the economy. Secondly, we have also seen that corporations, if Sweden has very high labor, the corporation or the manufacturing will be taken to areas where there is cheap labor. So all these have meant that there is a kind of color blindness, racism, where you don't see. It remains hidden in the attitudes, stereotyping, prejudices, and ignorance. But racism is still there, and it's a very important determinant of inequalities in healthcare, with migrant, for example, groups or minority groups taking the highest burden. So how do we break the silence? The methodology, this participatory methodology, one of its goals is to approach the problem, taking the users or local communities in their context and working there and trying to define things at the local level. And as you discuss, you create processes of discussions, you are also generating knowledge. As researchers, if we want to remain researchers, we are using that knowledge in the academia, but the communities are also taking action, and that is how we probably will need to do. Peter Reason calls this system as researching with, not on or about the people. And And there are two ways of doing this. We as researchers, which is the most common, can come like we are coming with our research and try to engage you. You as community members could say, we have a problem here. We want, somebody to come and help us, to do research with us, document what we are doing, so that we have a life with the project. Because we may need to move from where we come and just do things, do not document, do not reflect on what we are doing. So this system of working together is problem-focused, and there is an idea that action should also continue or come out of that, solve the practical problem of communities. It is cyclical, and this I call it, dancing, 2 steps and a turn. It means you are talking, you are working, you are reflecting, and then you are looking at what next. Like you diagnose the problem together, you plan what steps to take, you implement, and you evaluate, all collaboratively, and then take action. So both practical knowledge and theory match so that you don't go away with the data and hope you can come later. That is what the project is about, or participatory action methodology. Now, where are we in our project, which Hannah presented? The aim of study, as you heard, is to find shared vocabulary and implement anti-racist strategies. We are still at the beginning, and what we have done so far is, mapping the field using interviews, talking with healthcare caregivers, talking with care users, and then we hope, and then we have also been contacting institutions of training, like training the health care workers and other interested stakeholders or related stakeholders. And our hope is that then we can use the data, this mapping system we have been doing, reflect together in the contexts and see if it is a training, how do we improve the training of caregivers, the carers? How do we, in that training, how do we engage them to identify the racism that is hidden in the attitudes, in the stereotyping, and quietly in their daily work, which can be denied? So that is what we are planning to do. And then this is, of course, expected to create those communicative spaces and reflection possibilities for the dialogues that are taking place. So that's where we are. So we are hoping, if you feel that you have a problem that's related and or you are training and you like to discuss with us, we'll be very, very happy. And so far, I would say thank you very much. Tack så mycket.
Thank you. Okay, and so our last presenter, Elias.
So first and foremost, guys, I'm super honored to be here with our distinguished panelists. And I want to thank, first and foremost, for the invitation. It came rather late, but I'm always ready to talk about this subject. And also thank you to the organizers of this event, because I feel like these forums are super important for us, especially for us that work with these questions, with the human rights questions and civil rights, a forum for us to meet each other, to share each other's experiences, methods, and whatever. So super much thanks, as you say in Sweden. Super mycket tack. But over to today's topic. And I didn't have, I'm the odd one out. I didn't have a presentation, obviously, you can see. So you will have to satisfied just looking at me. I'm gonna try to make gestures and stuff so it becomes interesting to listen and such. But anyways, my name, as Sarah said, is Elias Ibrahim. I'm a lawyer at the Discrimination Bureau here in Östergötland. And we work with questions of discrimination. Obviously, race the discrimination comes in the picture. Also, I would say in some regard, the intersectionality between race and sometimes religion, because I would say it's closely connected, I would say. And where to start about the subject? I would like to start with myself, because as you can see, I'm a black person in Sweden. I was born in Sweden. And this means that I have to see the world from a very young age from two different perspectives. I was born all the way in Skellefteå, and for the Swedish people, you know that that's all the way north. I was basically born into the snow, you know what I'm saying? And in the end of the day, being Somali in Sweden, you have to have this constant struggle between cultures. Being Somali, I mean, one of the first things and one of the most trivial things is us Somalis, we always eat with the fork and in the right hand. And in Sweden, we eat with the fork in the left hand, and you cut with the right hand. And I remember one time my friend from the gymnasium from secondary school said, "Elias, are you really eating with your right hand?" I said, "Yeah, man, what's the problem? I mean, I'm just eating." And then he said, "Would you eat like that with the king? Because, I mean, it's proper form to eat with the fork in the left." I guess that was his point by pointing out that I was wrong, eating with the right hand. So even in these small, insignificant ways, you can see the difference in culture that you have to constantly struggle with as a young man born into dual cultures, I would say. But today's topic, anyways, racism, is a particularly hot topic still after 400 years. I mean, it's very strange, I would say, kind of ironic that we haven't dealt with this. Meanwhile, we have existential crisis like the chance of nuclear war and obviously the environmental, and we also have to deal with this, because I would say racism is also one of the things that is like a hindrance of humanity actually reaching its full potential, because we always know and we always hear that together we can do the most work, and by yourself, obviously, you cannot do a lot compared to doing all the work as a group. So I feel like just this question, the question about racism, is actually very important for us to discuss, even though it feels like we have been doing it for years. We still have to do it until it's over. And the phenomenon is pretty interesting. We talked about the biological racism, the cultural racism, but in the end, I would say, like in the beginning, this phenomenon was created. I would say it was manufactured by very intellectual and rather evil men, just to be able to take advantage of a thing like the slave trade and the colonialism. And so you have to, just like in the World War II, as the Nazi Party did with the Jews, you have to dehumanize the people that you have to use. Because if you don't dehumanize them, then obviously your own citizens will turn against you and will say to the party or the people in power, "Why are you doing this?" Because they're people just like us. So I would say internet is one of the tools today that are most effective against the racial biases that we have, because it's so easy for us to see a black person, because back in the days 400 years ago, all you saw was your neighborhood and your city, obviously. So if you can see everybody, if you can see a black person, if you can see a person from the Middle East, you're going to realize that they're not so much different from yourself, And obviously then you would not think twice until you start doing hate crimes. And obviously it's a double-edged sword, because being that the ideas and are so available, it's the same way the other way around. So very xenophobic ideas have also a very easy way of reaching the masses, just as much as these human rights ideas that we talk about today are easy to reach the masses. And when we are out talking to these organizations, even if it's the school or the company or maybe doctors and stuff, we talk about, we try to educate on the basic level that we all have generalizing beliefs that we carry in our backpack, that we don't really realize that we have these beliefs unless we have a moment to reflect over them, you know? And that's one of the things that I feel like it's a very effective tool to be able to shine a light on your own position in the society. And with that, you realize that you have other advantages that people of color or maybe disabled people. We talk about discrimination in general, obviously, when we are out educating people. But all of these things that we have in our backpack, and that we have all these prejudices that we have, it actually affects us and the way we receive people and the way we react to different things. I had actually I have an anecdote from one of the educational instances that I had with the people that are working with healthcare, elderly care, in one of the small municipalities in Sweden, in Östergötland. And we were talking about indirect discrimination. And indirect discrimination is like, it looks like a neutral, what's it called? Krav, but a neutral demand, exactly, that you have to have or reach to qualify for the job or whatever. And obviously this neutral demand affects certain groups more than other groups. So one of these neutral demands that we were talking about was actually the demand that you're supposed to be able to speak Swedish perfectly. If it's in one of our educational videos where the manager says, we cannot have this demand. It's basically discrimination. We cannot demand that people are speaking Swedish perfectly just to work in our workplace. And the employer says, but they have to be able to understand the elderly and the other employees. And obviously this rose some emotions in the group. And it was actually a pretty eye-opening experience for me too, and the group, because we were talking about this demand, just the language demand. And obviously this is something you need. You need to be able to understand the people that you're working with. You need to be able to write in the journal so that the person that takes the journal and reads it after you can understand what you've been doing and stuff like this. So one of the people we're talking about, one instance where they actually had one of the employees quit working at the workplace because of the demand. And then we started talking about this, and we started talking about how you do the journal citations and stuff. And we realized, because there was another person in the group who was actually new at the workplace, and this person said, well, there is no real training behind how to actually do how to write in the journal. So we discovered very quickly that the problem wasn't the person that was from another ethnic minority or from outside of Europe. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that they didn't receive enough education prior to actually doing the job, prior to writing these journals. And obviously, if you don't receive that education, even if you're speaking Swedish perfectly, just like me who's born here, this can be a very hard thing to do, like just jumping into work. And imagine having to deal with that and also being in training, learning the Swedish language. And I thought it was super interesting because this person just took for granted that it was the language that was the problem, but it was really the structure behind the training that was the problem. And I feel like a lot of these instances are similar. But anyways, Sarah told me it's 1 minute left. I'm not gonna hold up the time so much, and I'm looking forward to the panel questions later. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. So we can agree that this is a complicated issue. And like Elias said, it's a historical ideology that's been with us for more than 600 years. And it's also rendered invisible, specifically in Europe, and I would say more so in Sweden, because we're all anti-racist here, so it doesn't exist. But the data is showing something else. But before we go into the invisibility of racism, I would just like to discuss the different terms that are used, because we've used the term racism and also the term discrimination. So should we just call it discrimination? Or should we just stick to racism, or both? And how do those terms intersect, racism and discrimination? Where do they meet and where do they depart? So if we can discuss that. Hanna, you're looking at me, so you should start.
Okay, right. I think that racism is a specific form of discrimination. I think discrimination is the more general term, and one can be discriminated against on various grounds, including gender, age, ability, sexuality. I think it's worth being able to specify racist discrimination as a particular type, because it functions in slightly different ways from other forms of discrimination. But it's important to say that in making these distinctions, I understand that when a person experiences racism or a group experiences racism, it's not necessarily clear whether it's separate racism versus sexism versus ageism. Of course, discrimination happens in a much more muddled way when it's in practice, but it's useful to be able to distinguish for analysis, and therefore to be able to try and undo the effects of discrimination.
Anyone else?
So I think that's very much the reason why David Williams decided to try and capture discrimination, and then in terms of generally asking people, have they been unfairly treated in X domain? So in housing and education, on public transport. So everything from major experiences to everyday experiences. And then allowing people to say what they perceived to be the reason for that discrimination. And for us then to be able to explore that. So there's two ways of looking at that, and I agree with Hanna that we have to be specific, but in order to get specific, we have to move away from these ways of asking about it that either isolate people in terms of you can only be talking about racism and not any other type of, or racial discrimination and not any other type of discrimination. Or asking these in very loaded ways where you say, have you ever been discriminated against because of this and this and this and this and this? So actually trying to give the control back to people to actually tell us what they perceive to be the reason for that discrimination.
But then one might say that, well, maybe that's not racism. That is something else that you're feeling.
It's truth, and it's, people, every time I go to present on racism, discrimination, racial discrimination, any prejudice, anything related to that, someone is always going to try and say it's only your perception. But the truth is in its consequences, and I repeat that over and over and over again. If the person feels that they have been racially discriminated against, that is its truth. And that's what we must accept, regardless of the other person's intention, or regardless of, we can explain away a whole host of behaviors, but it does have merit. And we know that that perception and the way people describe those situations has a tremendous impact on people's health and their opportunities.
And I'd like to add to that too, before,
Yeah.
if I may.
Yes, sure.
But the Discrimination Act in Sweden, at least, actually gives this opportunity and this space, because it's not about the intention behind a certain way of talking to somebody, a certain way of acting. It's the effect that is at the center of the Discrimination Act. So I feel like that's a very important thing to shine a light on when we talk about these types of things like discrimination or racism. And also regarding the part where, like, oh yeah, you're just being sensitive, this part, it actually has its effect on the minority too, because just thinking about myself, I had an incident the other day where, and I talked to my colleagues about this, but I had an incident the other day where I was running towards the tram. I'm always late, obviously. And running towards the tram, and then I saw the tram coming, and I was super near the station, and I was waving to the conductor of the tram, just signaling, I'm trying to ride along, you know. And then this has happened before, and all the time this has happened before, the tram conductor stopped, because being nice and all, you know. Even if I was late and he was late, or she, they always stopped. And this time, the conductor didn't stop, you know? And I just stood there with my hands out like this, just asking myself, why did this happen? Because I came to the station, and I actually see that it's 2 minutes left. I was on time. She was being early, and she didn't stop. And you don't want to think, the first thought I had is obviously, it was a type of microaggression, you know. She didn't want to stop because she just saw me, and then she was like, nah, not today, son. I'm sorry. But, you know, this is the feeling you actually get, because the thing with microaggressions is we see these types of small, subtle, if you're in any minority, you see these things because you witness them and you go through them so much, and you don't want to say this, you don't want to believe that it's because of my race or because of my gender, but today we're talking about race, but you don't want to believe this at first hand. But if these types of things are thrown at you all the time, then that will be the only answer I can come up with in the end of the day.
And that is also, go ahead.
No, I quite agree that, I mean, of course, it's very, very complex, and we are not going to be able to decide on here, but I think there is a need. And looking at the way I look at this history, when you think of the decay of the welfare, the decay of the state, and at the same time, because this, what we call the structures of austerities, neoliberalism, they don't stop here, they are everywhere. It's a global phenomenon that destabilizes both here and there. And what we have come up with is the migration crises. It's something we never look at. But what happens is, of course, the migrants come here. They were not here in the colonial times, so they were not known. Now they are here. They are the ones eating, taking our jobs, taking our... So there is that climate we have also to deal with. And then the racism, of course, becomes, and one worries where we are heading to. Therefore, we have to clearly think, okay, the microaggressions are there. The silences are there. I mean, there are all kinds of attitudes, all kinds of stereotypes. But I think, yes, it's discrimination, but it is, of course, racism. It should not be left out. We should not use one word. I agree with you. That's what I agree. And it is how we are researching, how we are really trying to find how we can deal with it. that becomes quite central here.
Can we talk a bit about how, and you talked in your talk, Beth, about neoliberalism, and how neoliberalism alters dramatically the relation between the private and the state, and how that contributes then to rendering racism invisible.
Yeah, because now what I have seen, what we discuss here is like the state should, for example, provide this, provide that. But neoliberalism comes there and is doing something else. The most important ideology is the market, freedom. And that freedom means that it's eating just the system that we have been used to, the welfare. It's eating, so the silence, it introduces new processes and structures that we do not see. And that is what makes it invisible. But it doesn't make it invisible because at the same time as it is removing the power of the state to take care of its people, it is creating the other processes of people migrating everywhere and being visible. Now they are visible here. They were not visible before. And they can be a source of.
Isn't there a way of saying that quite simply, that neoliberalism introduces a profit motive into the production of welfare
exactly.
and healthcare, and as soon as you've got a for-profit logic playing out, then there's a need for cheap labour, and then those processes by which cheap labour is drawn into a rich northern welfare state are racialised.
And you know, in the end of the day, I remember, just because I'm so interested in these types of questions, so I'm usually in YouTube after hours, just checking all the different speakers talk about these subjects. And one in particular caught my attention. It was the former AU ambassador. I remember just seeing AU ambassador to the United States fired for this speech, and I was like, I have to see this. I have to see the speech.
YouTube got you.
Yeah, exactly. They always know what I want to watch. I wonder why. But anyway, so I watched this, and her name was Dr. Africana, for anybody who wants to watch. And Dr. Africana was talking about the 2019. This made me sick to my stomach when we were talking about neoliberalism and colonialism. She was talking about contract that is actually in effect today. It's called the Pact of the Continuation of Colonization. And I was like, really? 2019, we still have African countries abiding by this act? And this act says stuff like 60%, okay, France, and it's between France and the West African and Central African countries. And it says basically that these countries are gonna get their monetary money from the French Central Bank, but you're gonna have to, in the end of the day, put 60% of your foreign reserves into our bank. We may or may not give you them back, okay? And if you want it back, then you have to pay commercial interest rates. And obviously this affects the people in these countries, and they get sick, and they don't have a strong welfare, they don't have a strong education. And they, in the end, when they come here, we get angry because they're taking our jobs. They're leeching on our systems. But in the end of the day, it's the Western politicians' work, basically under the radar, that are enabling these things to happen in the end of the day. So I just wanted to say that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So if we go back to the issue of racism within healthcare, as we've talked, it's quite subtle. So it's not like direct racism. A doctor doesn't say, I'm not going to treat you because you're black or you're a Muslim. It happens in subtle ways. So how do we deal with that methodologically? And I know that, Hanna, you've written about structural violence as a way to frame racism. If you could talk about that a bit.
Structural violence is a way of trying to think about how the the organizational routines and ways of regularly processing stuff can make it easier to deprioritize certain groups. So structural racism is not meant to be a way of excusing individual racism, but it's meant to be a way of understanding how systems interact with individual workers to create conditions that are discriminatory without any individual ill intent. I think that's what you were asking me about.
Yeah, and also that it works through those invisible processes within healthcare.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's one of the ways that keeps practices discriminatory, and it's quite difficult to detect on a kind of one-to-one basis. But we should be able to understand them if we can diagnose our systems.
So that if you have someone experiencing racism, then we can believe them if we see it as structural violence that is historical, right? And we don't have to brush it away and say, oh, this is not racism that you're experiencing. Can we talk a little bit about the legal aspects, Elias?
The
In
legal
Sweden,
aspects of structural
of
just the
racism,
structural racism.
within healthcare.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because when we try to look at the numbers, especially in Sweden, we have our it's called Patientnämnden, and all of us know what it is. It's
The patient advisory committee.
exactly the patient advisory board. They are the ones who receive all these complaints about the healthcare complaints. And when they receive these complaints, they actually categorize them in different categories. It's like one for how you were treated, basically, how you were received. And there's one about the access to the healthcare, like more about disability access and stuff like this. And there is no categories talking about this legal, because according to the Discrimination Act, everybody has to work with this researching the risks for every single ground of discrimination, including race, including religion, you know? And there is no such categorization right now in any patient advisory board, I think, because I talked to one...
Just to clarify, there's no
Yeah.
category called racism.
There's no category
Or
called
discrimination.
discrimination, and then no undercategory going to race or whatever it would be. So in the end of the day, if there is no way to actually see the experiences, because people actually go there obviously and say, I experienced a bad reception, I think it's because I'm black, you know, my child didn't go through all the way to the doctor because I think it was because we were black or something like this, because we were Arab, because we were from the Middle East. And nowhere can you see this in their statistics, you know. I actually talked to one of the representatives of the patient advisory board from Stockholm, and he told me that they have actually been working on this for 6 years. So now 2020 will be the first time in Stockholm's patient advisory board that you will be able to categorize these complaints in accordance with the Discrimination Act. And this is obviously a step forward in the right direction. But then again, it's very hard, you know, not just talking about the categorization, but if we talk about the experiences, you know. We had one case now where the ombudsman is actually suing Gothenburg's region, the region of Gothenburg, for discrimination, because the case was a father who was playing football or something. He hit his head very badly, and he got home, he fainted and stuff like this after he got home. And his wife called the ER and said, my husband is in really bad shape. He hit his head, he's passing out, blah, 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 blah. And obviously, when they got this call, it was a priority one case. It was like, he has to get here now. We have to get him here now. So they send the ambulance, and then the ambulance comes, and the person working who was there at the scene categorize this as some sort of like fake feigning, you know? He was exaggerating. She even said in the journal, kulturell svimning, like cultural feigning. That's how they what they wrote in the journal. And obviously he got down prioritized, deprioritized, and this man had he actually died at the ER because he didn't get the MRI scan, you know, in time. So these types of things, they actually happen. This is a very extreme case, but they happen. And we don't want to accept the fact that they are happening. We're like in denial, sort of, as a society, because we think we're 2019, we have come so far with these questions, but they actually can lead to the worst case scenarios, you know.
And if such a case happens, then where does one go to legally?
They can come to us, our discrimination bureau, if it happens here in Östergötland. We have 16 other organizations, anti-discrimination bureaus that are working with the same types of cases. We obviously have the ombudsman. Hopefully you could get help from the patient advisory board or the inspection of the hospitals, IVO, Inspektionen för vård och omsorg. And hopefully you can get something done, but it's very hard. It's very hard to get something done in actuality. Our laws are very good, but in practice it's very hard to get any access to justice, unfortunately.
So just maybe final words on, I mean, this is something that affects people's health status. In extreme cases, people may die because they're perceived that they exaggerate their symptoms and so on. So how do we deal with this issue?
Well, the thing that we're trying to do in our project is create workplace-based discussions that allow these difficult aggressions to be spoken about, because as long as they are unspoken, then it's almost impossible to get at them. So that seems like a first step.
Okay, yeah.
I think myself as an outsider to Sweden, and I've been here several times, and what always strikes me is how sure and confident everyone is that racism doesn't matter. I guess my question is always then, so why don't you prove that it doesn't matter? So why don't we just decide to ask people more widely about their experiences and collect this information? And if it is, as you say it is, then we won't find it, right?
That'd be great.
That would be, you know, and I just also think that it's important, you know, the National Health Service is by no means perfect or necessarily the ones that have led on this type of action, but I think the movement and the policies behind the workforce race equality standard are incredibly powerful in terms of holding health services accountable.
In the UK, you're talking.
Yes, and I think something like that is incredibly important.
No, I agree with you that we really have to look for methods that get us together and talk and reflect. And this is, of course, also between, policymakers, because, and
This is not a problem that one section of the healthcare workforce can address. It's a shared problem, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely, yes. That's the thing. So we have to rethink on the kinds of researches we are doing and engaging communities, policymakers. That becomes very, very central in both talking about the problem, accepting that the problem is there, however minor, however the small things that are being done, that we have to really accept, yes, this is where we have come, because things have changed so that the violence is very under. It doesn't, it's not, it's death, it's sickness. For certain people, the inequalities have to be discussed in another way that puts the problem on the surface.
And obviously, I would say insight is like one of the bases for even working towards the solution of a problem, obviously. But then again, you have to think about your audience too. You know, if I go to my different work assignments anyway, and try to take, if I just bring all the extreme cases, people will not receive this. They will just, it will hit a wall, you know? So you have to work with some type of case that they can relate to. Maybe that could have happened to me if the situation was the other way around. So you have to really think about who your audience is too, because insight is one of the most important things in the work towards justice when it comes to the question of racism, obviously.
Thank you. So discussing the subject is important. So any questions from the audience? Over there. 3, 4. That over there was the first person. But my God. Okay.
My name is Kwame Ingemar, meaning 25% African. I studied and made a book about AIDS, and during my research for that book, I came over what I think is the highest form of racism. An article published in 1970 in American Military Review had the title, Ethnic Weapons. First time in the world that was said. Later on, I got that full article from an Afro-American, and then I read it, and it was true. And the worst thing, the author of that article was Carl R. Larsson, head of Department of Genetics, University of Lund, Sweden. And as of yet, I have written about it in Swedish language. But Count Uppsala counteract on that article. It was that awful. Ethnic weapons. And that's for you, Hannah. And for Beth, I give another question too. When studying AIDS issues, the Americans said, and they blamed Africa for AIDS, whereas African, and that's the healthcare sector, epidemiologists, doctors, and so forth from Uganda, and even one Nobel Prize winner from Kenya, female, said the opposite. AIDS started in Africa, Uganda 82, Kenya 84, 2, 3, 4 years after it started in New York.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
So isn't that a very big thing of racism, Beth?
Well, yeah.
Do you want us to collect a few questions and then...
Yeah,
the
there
panel
was
can-
one over there. She was the first
We
one.
had one over here as well.
She was first.
Oh, sorry.
My name is Eva Nikeli. I work for the Equality Ombudsman, or the Anti-Discrimination Ombudsman. I have been working with discrimination in healthcare for many years in my organization. And I would say to your discussion first that race discrimination or ethnic discrimination is very subtle in healthcare. I would not agree. Our cases, our complaints concerning healthcare, and especially concerning the discrimination ground of ethnic belonging or race, is very open and very brutal. And it's mainly doctors, trained doctors, private practitioners or trained doctors in the hospitals who are doing the discriminatory applying the discriminatory practice, and it's often with open racist arguments, as or connecting it with the skin color, connecting it with the dress, connecting it sometimes with Islamophobic comments on language and things like that, if a person wears a headscarf and so on. So I would say the subtle discrimination combines much more with the other discrimination grounds, like sexual orientation or disability, for instance, but not with race and ethnic belonging in hospital care. And we have something like 700-800 complaints about discrimination in healthcare, and something the like in terms of social care. And they are quite interesting to look into, and it has a lot to do with, as Elias also said, with treatment, respectful or not respectful treatment. And according to also what you said, the Patient Advisory Board in Stockholm has done a very interesting job in looking into their material. And they have 30,000 complaints per year. So that would be something for you to look into in this research project. I think it's very important and interesting.
Thank you so much. There was a question over there, and then a question over here.
Thank you very much for the very interesting discussions. My name is Nyamusi Nyambog from Afro-Swedish National Organization. Listening to you, we realize that the racism and the discrimination we're talking about is deeply embedded to historical iterations that have been. You talked about the colonial project, you talked about enslavement, and you also talked about, it has been 400 years. But we know that in Sweden, we try to exclude ourselves from having been part of the colonial project and even enslavement, which is totally not true, as we have realized lately. Sweden was very much involved in enslavement and colonialism. So then the question here is, where do we start from? Because being in denial and not having the terms and names to not being able to name and have concept, we cannot find ways or methodologies of tackling the problem. And then Beth also mentioned that we should be able to do research that is inclusive in a way that we don't talk about people, but we talk with people or on people. But when I look at the demography here, it honestly says something different, because the people we're discussing today, I can easily number. So how do we get to have like a national conversation or dialogue that is all inclusive, especially the stakeholders who are extremely affected? Thank you.
Thank you. One last question.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you as well for a brilliant presentation. I think it's great that we are finally talking about racism. I've been to several presentations yesterday and today where about refugees who are unable to access health, and the word racism never comes up. It's almost like, yeah, we don't talk about it. And I think someone, the closest they got to, they say that the staff showed unwelcoming behavior, and that was what the sort of what the hindrance for this. So I am truly grateful that we are talking about it, because I think, just to follow up on what you were saying, I think in Sweden we definitely need to talk about. I mean, now the latest poll shows that SD, a political party with Nazi roots, is now the biggest party in Sweden. So I think if we don't talk about it, it's going to go bad. And my question is, how do we start? talking about it. Thank you.
Thank you. So very quickly, racism in healthcare is not so subtle. It's actually quite direct. And then there was a question about this. It's almost the same question here: Swedish exceptionalism and how to start a dialogue about racism in healthcare.
You seem to be looking at me.
No, anyone. You're just closest to me, so.
To Eva's point, I would say, yeah, the complaints that come in are very extreme a lot of the times. But just talking about my own experience, I have a lot of friends, family, who are experiencing tough spots, very subtle microaggressions and stuff like this, that they don't really want to talk about. I mean, we're almost denying the fact that it matters when these types of small, subtle acts of racism actually come to us for the first time. And I believe we always say that in our when we looked at especially the healthcare sector, that people lose faith in the system when they are subject to racism or subject to sexism. And this is an important fact, because you're less likely to actually even file a complaint because you don't think anything is going to happen. And that's why I think there is a lot of subtle acts of racism. And I know it for a fact that there's a lot of subtle acts. If you hear all the anecdotes, it's never about these very extreme cases. It's always about these subtle cases, and you don't really know what happened.
And I guess it's easier to complain about the direct cases.
Yeah, and it's easier, obviously, to dust off your shoulder at the given moment, you know?
But I would argue you're not dusting it off.
You're
not dusting it off. It has a weathering effect.
Of course. But
right?
I mean,
and it's something that begins when you're quite small, and you carry that with you. And that's why I keep coming back to the evidence showing this is something that's raising, like any other stressor, any other stressful life event.
Of course.
It's raising your blood pressure. It's affecting your sleep. It's related to your mental health problem. And over time, these things have a wear and tear on you.
Of course.
And so that's the difficulty. I think when you start to press upon people that this isn't just about, whether or not that group over there feels better about being able to talk about the things that are affecting them, that this is affecting their health in a way, and it's affecting our society, and like you said, the ability for everyone to join together to be better together.
I take the point that some incidents are brutal, as you said, absolutely, and I think some of the words that were being used in the stories we were told made that clear. And I think the failure to talk about it is getting to emergency levels, actually, and it's because liberal Sweden hasn't talked about it that Sverigedemokraterna have been able to create the discourse that has had purchase and has explained things. And if we had been able to put another set of stories out sooner, we might have closed up some of that space that's being occupied politically.
Yeah, I would say that is one of the most important things to recognize, especially 2019, America, Brexit, whatever. We have the same changes going on in Europe, Poland, Ukraine, and these are actually in behind the scenes economical questions, because if you have a situation where people are losing their pensions, they're going minus every year, and they're losing their jobs, and they're feeling worse in their mental health, and you find an antagonist, you just shed the light and you say that this is where you're supposed to focus all your hate, not at the wealthy, because in reality, also the wealth gap is going farther and farther apart. It's growing, and these are the real problems. And when you have a party like Sverigedemokraterna who are actually recognizing these real issues and just pointing the finger at somebody else, then it's the failure of the centrist parties and the liberal parties.
Pointing at her watch over there.
I think they're going to kick us
out. Are we? Because I wanted to react
Yes.
to Nyamusi. We don't have an answer, but we are saying we cannot continue just in the silence that we are putting in, or the use of different vocabularies. And of course, collaborative methodologies have been are being used, and I think in some areas, still in the healthcare within Sweden, you can make regional kind of collaborations using different stakeholders. So it's possible, but it is not one of the easiest methodologies.
I would say that now the onus is on researchers to stop doing business as usual and to engage communities, which is why I talk about reciprocity as a basic, sort of ethos of conducting research, but also we've got to get more involved so that community engagement, let the community set the priorities. Absolutely. Instead of us sort of sitting back and deciding which areas. So being actively involved with our communities and the importance of thinking locally and acting locally and then growing that out from there. I think that that's the model we should all be aiming for.
Yes. Thank you. And of course, we can discuss this forever, but we have to end this here. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.